Shutter speed plays an important role in the exposure triangle next to aperture and ISO. Okay, Lexi, what do I need to know about shutter speed? Shutter speed is important for two main things: exposure and motion blur. Okay. Firstly, shutter speed is controlled by the shutter. This is a curtain that opens up in front of your camera's sensor. With film cameras, this is electronic to avoid the noise. So I assume the longer the curtain is open, the more light it's letting into the camera? That's correct. With a longer shutter speed, your camera's curtain will be open for a longer period of time. This results in a brighter exposure and more motion blur. What's motion blur? Motion blur is an effect. When something moves in the frame, it leaves blurred motion behind it. So, pour yourself a glass of water. Okay. Currently, you're seeing this at 30 frames per second, which means your shutter speed is at 1/60th of a second. The movement looks almost natural. That's correct. Look at what happens when you pour the glass at 30 frames per second at 1/2 of a second. What's going on? When the camera moves at this speed, you're guaranteed to get motion blur from the objects in the frame and camera blur. I don't like this. Most filmmakers do not, which is why the 180-degree rule is so important and a general rule of thumb for filmmaking. You mean when shutter speed is half the frame rate to keep it natural? Yes. So assuming that 1/2 of a second creates a significant amount of motion blur, then something like 1/1600 has little to no motion blur. Yes, if you were to film at 30 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/1600 of a second, then it would be so crisp that it would be discomforting to the human eye. Why is that? The reason why we film at half the frame rate is because that is what's most similar to the human eye on a day-to-day basis. Something like 1/1600 of a second would be extremely unnatural to the human eye. What if I'm facing an exposure predicament and I've done everything I can with aperture and ISO? You might get away with changing your shutter speed by a small amount, but it's best to invest in lighting or an ND filter. They will both help to change your exposure without sacrificing your creative and logical decisions. Well, if shutter speed is better off not being messed with, then why is it even an option? Once you get used to properly exposing your image with ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, then you could take more risky and creative decisions. Woo! That's correct. Look at what happens when you pour the glass at Look at what happens when you pour the glass at 30 frames per second. I feel like. Yes. Okay, wait.